So, morning, John. How's it going?
Hi, Jude. Really well, thanks. Yeah, how are you?
Brilliant. So, thanks so much for taking the time to have a chat this afternoon. It's kind of a funny little serendipitous way that I ended up getting in touch with you. That I just saw you posting a questionnaire for industry people to basically give feedback and be more informed about current legislation around batteries. But I'm also aware that you're not a battery specialist and you're not an expert in legislation. But at the same time, you still seem to be doing some great work in trying to move the needle. So I'm wondering if, in your own words, could you give a little bit of a story of your career, but also how you found yourself in this place, trying to be a provocateur for better design and better awareness?
Thank you, Jude. Yeah, well, 30 years ago, which is obviously a very long time ago, I was at university. I did environmental science, very general. It's because I was a failed geographer, but anyway, we won't gloss over that. And it was really interesting times. I started in '92, and it was the first year that there was an IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And I read that, and I was like, wow, this is really big stuff. And obviously, vaguely aware of everything going on, and only 18. Pretty much since then, a kind of like twin tracking almost with the growing body of evidence of by looking out the window, weather is becoming climate and climate is becoming quite serious. And so 30 years later, maybe we should have acted a bit faster.
Mm.
I've become, some might say wiser, others would disagree, but certainly more knowledgeable and experienced and slightly more impatient. I don't think I started with much patience, and I've pretty much run out. And so from a sort of my vantage point, trying to make a bit of a difference and a bit of a change, and try and force some issues. And batteries is one of them, actually. I just feel really strongly about. I've been in and around the industry, the waste management, if you want to call it that, resources and waste, recycling, raw materials industry for my whole career. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, and this issue that we're going to talk about is a really important one from that end of pipe perspective. But my brain is one that is up the other end, trying to understand what can we do differently and how can we fix the problems we've got.
No, that's great. And I think I sort of just really appreciated also just from the way you were framing things, a very accessible and common sense approach to it rather than a jargon heavy and sort of legalese approach, which dare I say, for my own benefit of having to sort of bootstrap myself into this subject, it's been really helpful. So maybe to sort of jump into it, I just wondered could you give a little bit of a summary of what the, I need to get this right, 2006 66/EC directives on batteries, but basically a sort of right to repair bill, isn't it? But what does that actually mean for designers and consumers?
Well, I think, I mean, the right to repair movement, obviously you're really key part of this, is a very important thing. It's really, really fundamental. And I'll come back to why in a minute, but I think actually it could solve a lot of problems in and of itself. If things were sold with the ability to be repaired, I think we'd have fewer issues. One of the really big issues we've got, is batteries that are in things that when the regulations were originally developed, and even when they've been updated, we weren't thinking that batteries would be in all these things that they're in now, and the way they're in them as well. So they're embedded within. They're not something that's detachable or removable. Phones are a good example now. The batteries are integral. Laptops as well, whereas obviously first gen, second gen, they were all removable, replaceable. You might take your battery out if you didn't want anyone to ring you, for example, which you can't actually do now. So let alone when it breaks or stops working or whatever. So I think that right of repair or right to repair is a really fundamental part of changing the I suppose the relationship between people who buy things and use things and people who make them and sell them. And actually, it's in the consumer's interest. So I see this very much as a consumer championing, thing that we're both involved with, because it's for consumers and it's all about value. We've been chasing cost, and cheap is good. Well, cheap isn't good because cheap doesn't necessarily last very long, and corners are cut, or oversimplification occurs because it's convenient. And actually, I wonder if, and I'm not one of those people who sort of dreams up problems, but I do wonder if, that sort of, embedding batteries in particular within a product where you can't replace them is actually part of the process of selling you another one. Because it won't work after a while, and it can't be repaired. So that sort of built-in obsolescence is clearly a very good way of selling more cheap stuff. And I fundamentally have a problem with that. But it is on behalf of the consumer that I think, where we're positioning ourselves and where actually the solutions come from.
I mean, yeah, strangely, I hadn't actually planned to ask you this question, but I think it's a sort of an obvious riff off your comments. I happen to have here a battery, a lithium polymer battery that came out of a vape. And I should point out, I didn't have to go to a shops and buy one. It was just one of many that are in the hedges around the local park where my kid walks around. And these are actually quite dangerous, as, for anyone who doesn't know, if they're punctured or damaged, they can basically turn into like a mini fireball. And that's not an exaggeration if you look on YouTube for these things. But my point is that it's staggering as a designer how much tech and how much stuff is in a disposable vape. And yet it is marketed as being a single use. Yet this type of battery, and you can go up and look at the serial number on this. This one actually, I looked at it the other day, is good for 500 recharge cycles, which means it obviously isn't a single-use battery. It's the nature of lithium polymer chemistry is such that you can recharge it many, many, many times. And so to put this in a vape, which I appreciate, the other part of the equation is, can you top up, can you recharge the liquid, the vape chemicals? But I think that's where legislation can, and indeed I think the UK is now starting to ban these things. At the same time, I think it's worth acknowledging that's a very cheap product. Whereas, for example, the headphones, which actually is how I started on this journey, it's much more expensive. So would you say it is a more reasonable ask of designers to factor in that additional cost and complexity into making a user replaceable system?
Yeah, and I think they're two really good examples, and I'm sure in a minute we'll come back to a couple of other examples where we've been testing consumer views on similar issues. And in fact, we've asked about vapes, and I'll probably, we're not quite ready to publish that yet, but I think there are some really, really interesting perspectives around that. And I think the first perspective actually is that people are really surprised. They're surprised that that sort of battery is in that sort of product without any responsibility, really. I mean, there's a rule and a regulation, but there isn't really any responsibility at end of life other than something that someone might feel, which they're probably not going to feel like it. So so as a result, it's in a hedge, right? And that's the short version of it. I think the issue is that the regulations are out of date. They don't work. They haven't kept up with market activity. They aren't chemistry specific in the way they need to be. So, lithium ion, for example, it's listed, but it's not, you don't have to try very hard to comply. There's vast amounts of lead acid batteries, particularly car batteries, being recycled. And generally speaking, the targets are being hit by doing easy stuff. So the difficult stuff isn't happening. That means that there isn't really a concentration of effort on collecting the stuff that's causing the biggest hazard, which is the sort of things you've just given an example of. And what's happening is they're ending up in a bin, whether it's a recycling bin, a rubbish bin, or a litter bin. We all know the process. A big vehicle comes and collects those. The stuff is tipped into the back of the big vehicle, whether it's rubbish or recycling. It then goes through a process of collecting more bins and taken to a depot where it's sorted out. Through that process, it's entirely likely that any battery that's in there or thing with a battery in it is going to end up crushed. And if that happens, lithium has a bit of a party with the oxygen, and you're surrounded it by fuel, plastic and paper and whatever else. So you've surrounded a thing that's highly likely to become, incendiary in some way with a bunch of fuel. As soon as you tip that out, the oxygen, is introduced, the thing goes up, and you've got a fire, potentially a big fire. That means you've got death and damage and death, probably in that order. It doesn't mean every time someone's going to die, but every time that happens, someone is at risk of being damaged, being, injured, or potentially being killed. And that can't be acceptable. So that's the reality every single day, pretty much every single waste and recycling facility all over the country. and that's a reality, and that needs to be checked. So that's why I'm interested in this, because I know some of these people, and they're really good people, and they do brilliant work, and it's not the nicest job. And then this risk has been introduced. It's risky enough anyway. We've introduced this new risk of all these batteries that have all these potential risks, and they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be in the rubbish bin in any form, you know. But the infrastructure, the information, the public awareness isn't there, and this is part of what we're talking about, isn't there to make sure that those batteries don't end up in the wrong place, and there aren't enough ways of making sure they end up in the right place. So that's kind of where we've got to. All this cheap stuff with batteries in it that are probably over spec. Actually, the one you just showed is an over spec. You know, it's going to last 500, you know, charges or whatever. You know, is a couple of years in theory. If you charge it every day, it's a year or two. You know, we're now into like phones. This phone, you know, is an iPhone. It could be any of them, doesn't really matter. We're into 24-month contracts now because they are expensive, right? And you know, to get it to a reasonable amount per month, it has to be over a longer period, a bit like cars, right? So we've now got this thing which the battery in it might be guaranteed for 600 or 500 recharges. Well, if you're on a 24-month contract, you are now through, assuming you charge it once a day, use it a lot, you're through the number of charges that a typical battery is maybe guaranteed for. So that's quite interesting because there's an inbuilt issue with those sorts of gadgets. So I think we're at a tipping point now where, you know, it's becoming more important for lots of reasons, not just because some people who collect your bins are put at risk, even though I feel that is the most important thing. And that's kind of where that's my sort of starting point, I suppose, with why I feel really strongly about these issues and why they need sorting out.
And I think the you know, I mean, often there's always a sort of circular debate of, is it industry, is it legislation and government, or is it the consumer? And you can go round and round and round, but it seems like ultimately the punchline is it's a little bit of everything working together to sort of move the needle. But I think what legislation can do is that, you know, yes, it can have a PR campaign and make consumers feel more inclined to sort of be discerning, but I think also to sort of, you know, restrict so should we say sloppy or just casual behavior of design companies to just take these things a bit more seriously. One of the punchlines of my blogs is not to say that everything should just automatically overnight be accessible so that anyone can go in and take out one of these batteries. The fact is, lithium polymer is a little bit dangerous, and I wouldn't want, say, my mum and dad just tinkering around with it. Having said that, if it is what's called a sealed battery, which is what the old school phones used to be, it's perfectly safe. And so it does cost a little bit more money, but I think this is where legislation says, if you just completely ignore this, we're going to penalize you on the end of life. So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about what does this term mean, the end of life, for companies, and how do you think designers might be, if not, should we say, inspired, but at least motivated to sort of, you know, consider these things a little bit more keenly than they have at present?
Yeah, I was talking about this yesterday with someone, and I if I was a no-win, no-fee lawyer at the moment, I might be looking at this, because if there's stuff in your hallway, in your shared flat, being charged overnight, and it's not clear whether it's the right charger and all that, if that, and this has happened, you know, and it's been tragic as well. If that goes up, there are multiple people potentially affected by that fire, and there's definitely some liability in that. So that's one. I think there's a, hey, do you really understand what you're doing, or what, as a sort of an online retailer of multiple sellers might, you know, without naming any, do you understand what you are enabling? You're enabling the importation and sale of cheap things that maybe aren't very good, that don't have enough information with them, and certainly don't have any responsibility at end of life because no one's there to do it, you know. And all of the time, bear in mind, again, this is for the consumer, right? The consumer's paying for a thing which is cheap or might be valuable, doesn't matter. They're paying for a thing, and at the end of its life, they're paying again to get rid of it, because almost a lot of this, where it's not being recovered or there's no take back campaign or scheme or whatever is going in the domestic dustbin in one form or another.
Mm-hmm.
And we are all paying for that as consumers. So we think we're getting a cheap deal at the one end, but at the other end, we're actually paying. And if there's a fire that affects the collection vehicle and your bins are missed, you're definitely going to be the first person. We are going to be those people making a complaint. Why wasn't my bin collected? Well, it wasn't collected because one of you put a battery in it, but actually it's not your fault for putting a battery in it. You weren't told. So again, we follow it, chase it all the way back up. It's way too late. When it gets to this end, you know, the collecting it and trying to do something with it, way too late. We've already failed multiple times. So what I think is really interesting is, you know, how can we fix those problems? And there are probably 2 or 3 ways of doing this. And as you know, I'm writing a report on this at the moment. It's not going to be a high-tech report. It's not going to be about, you know, how we change the regulations in every minute detail. There's just some fundamental, pretty obvious stuff, really. There's the chemistry of batteries, which I think is really important. And that's something that could be probably changed quite rapidly, you know, to really pick up on the lithium ion piece. Then there's some sort of medium term stuff that, you know, around deposits potentially on items with batteries in, which could be something that we could do as an intermediate step. And then ultimately there's the right to repair, which is really a design and eco-design kind of led piece, isn't it? And I think those 3 probably need to work in conjunction, because, for example, you know, just thinking at the moment about, I mean, I think the chemistry is really obvious and it's something that needs to happen straight away. There needs to be some funding for consumer campaigns, but there probably won't be until there's some chemistry specific targets that mean that more difficult stuff needs to be collected, maybe differently. And I still don't think the weight of compliance should be on local authorities, because we're dealing with some quite tricky stuff here, and it, you know, it's hard to add another container onto an already stressed refuse collection vehicle or recycling vehicle. And I do think there needs to be a consumer and retailer kind of relationship on some of these things anyway. And just because it's a bit difficult for somebody shouldn't mean it isn't pursued. So deposits, I think, can play a really important role, because what they can do is they can valorize things that are cheap, and they can drive different decisions. So a deposit isn't just about you know, money. It's actually about challenging why. It's challenging why a certain thing happens a certain way. So if you think about a deposit on a plastic bottle, partly it's about getting the plastic bottle back, but partly it's about challenging the consumer. Do I need to buy that? And the maker, the seller, could I do that differently? How could I provide this service? Because unless your key business is making plastic bottles, actually your service is getting a drink to somebody. Like the product is the drink, surely, not the plastic bottle. But that's slightly provocative, because
no, I think it's a great idea, and maybe we should just stress for the audience who maybe hasn't traveled around, but I lived in Norway for a year, and this system was the pant system, which meant I think it was like a krona for a bottle, which is sort of about 10 pence. And so these systems have been going around the world. It's not actually an alien concept. It's just whether we can, you know, take that as an analogous reference to deploy on batteries.
And the point, absolutely, the point is that I mean, even in the UK, we had, I think we are roughly probably the same age. I think we talked about this. I remember deposits. You remember deposits on soda bottles.
Iron Brew, yeah.
Iron Brew, that was the one. I was Panda Pops, but anyway. But it, you know, Corona and all that, you know, when we were in the 80s or late 70s. And you know, so it's absolutely not alien, but the purpose of it is about making sure that better decisions are made and making sure that things end up where they're supposed to end up so that they can be managed properly. So if you follow that through to batteries, something like this phone again, if this stops working or I choose to upgrade or whatever and I'm out of contract, a phone, even though it's small enough to drop into a bin, it probably won't go into a bin. It might sit in your drawer for 10 years, and that's another issue. But it's highly likely to end up at an exchange or repair shop, or sold secondhand or passed on or whatever. And although it's difficult, it could be repaired. It could be, the battery could be replaced. Even though these ones particularly are well sealed, and you know all about But with something like, say, for example, an electric rechargeable toothbrush, which might be, 10, 20 quid. And again, really small, drop into a bin, doesn't have any inherent value, very hard to repair, especially if the batteries are embedded and they're not replaceable, but rechargeable, they'll tend to be, embedded. When that stops working for whatever reason, the likelihood is that you'll drop it in a bin. So rather than assume that, which is my assumption, we went and spoke to people about it. So we've done a survey of 2,000 plus UK adults, again, about to be published, not published yet. And we asked them, what do you do with, different items, small ones that are cheaper, big ones that are more cumbersome but more difficult to manage, like a rechargeable mower or leaf blower or whatever, at the sort of far end. So they're not as valuable, but and hard to repair, but they're too big to put in your bin. And then the stuff in the middle that's more valuable and maybe a bit bigger, but you could still lose it if you wanted to. And these things are the ones that people take to shops or exchange or sell. Toothbrushes, and those sort of vapes as well, those sorts of things, they will be dropped into a bin.
Well, they also have a hygiene element, right? I mean, one of the discussions with LV about sort of feminine IoT devices basically is that certain things you would pass down, but certain things you just wouldn't because it's too intimate. And I think a toothbrush certainly falls into that sort of category of you don't really want to inherit that.
And it's small and cheap. And so it's the size and the value that are, there's some hygiene issues definitely that would drive decisions, but primarily it's about size and value. And so that's where deposits can play a really important role. So if you imagine, like, say you just took a blanket 10% as a deposit value, it would be ludicrous, because this would be a 100 quid or something deposit, 50, 100 quid deposit, which is ridiculous, because that isn't actually the bad behaving item, right? That is behaving very well. It's kind of generally going where you want it to go. It's not going in a bin. But equally, by the same measure, a couple of quid on a toothbrush works really well. And actually a couple of quid on that might just be enough. It doesn't really, it's more significant. It's more significant on small, cheap things than it's more sort of, it just tells a story really when it gets to a more expensive product. So we've tested that, and it's gone down actually quite positively. So as much as, you might read a headline in a newspaper about deposits, people are generally quite positive about it. They either remember, or they've traveled, or they just see the logic of it. And it's not scary. It makes a lot of sense. So I think that's a really important part. And then, then the right to repair actually reinforces and supports deposits, or is reinforced and supported by deposits. Because if you have something which, you can repair, then it's highly likely you're going to be able to service the battery, right? So, and if you're designing it so that your product has a greater value to a consumer, the battery will be replaceable. And therefore, three birds with one stone, or whatever analogy you want to use there, is probably less violent than that. But it's, all those things in consort working together are really, really good at making sure that things last a bit longer, they're designed better, and they're not dangerous when you throw them away.
And I think that's sometimes the thing, which I would hope is a little bit what I'm trying to sell to, should we say, my fellow designers in my networks, which many of them are already sort of preaching to the converted. I appreciate. So I think actually what the feedback I'm getting is that often doing this sort of design actually leads to a better user experience that engenders essentially a better love for the product. And I do think, Fairphone's headphones are actually a really nice example of this, of being able to say, damn it, I messed up one of the cables. I can switch that out, or I can put a new battery in. Because again, for anyone who's less familiar with battery technology, this 500 cycles, if you quickly do the maths and say, hang on a minute, that means my headphones would stop working in about 2 to 3 years. You're like, yeah, exactly. I've had these for 6 years, and they're still great. I've just repaired them as part of this project. They'll go another 6 maybe. But it's that thing of, I think designers will actually be quite excited to think, not just, oh, look, someone's got my latest generation, but oh my God, someone's got that. It's from 10 years old. It's still going strong. I hope that that becomes the new pride in designers as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think with that, there's how do we service?
Mm,
How do we deliver that outcome? And this is the challenge for some companies where, maybe they've got sort of they've become a thing that makes a lot of stuff
mhm.
and has to sell a lot of stuff rather than a thing that has customers for life, and they are sticky and they love you and they cherish your product. Because we've kind of chased this cheap, and cheap is value, but cheap isn't value. For exactly the example you've just given there, even a high quality product, if you can't service it, it's less valuable.
Yeah.
You're paying for two pairs when one pair should do.
Mhm.
And if they break too soon, you're highly likely to go to a different, you might have the same experience, but you're highly likely to go to a different supplier. So you go from Sony to Panasonic or whatever, because you think, well, it should have lasted a bit longer than that.
Mm.
And the batteries run out, and that's or it won't recharge anymore. It doesn't hold its charge, or whatever the
Yeah.
fail is. That's not fair. But does that company know that? Because they only had one iteration with you. They only sold to you once, and
Yeah.
you stopped answering their emails or clicking on their website, but they didn't really notice because they've got a billion customers. So I think there's a loss of sensitivity around that relationship piece. And actually, how then does a company understand that? One, understand it, so talk to customers. Two, how do they move on from that? Well, I think it's probably around service and servitization.
Mhm.
So how can we keep you listening to great music for the rest of your life? That's the service, right? Or the outcome. And
Yeah.
the answer to that is to have a relationship with you where we'll repair it, we'll upgrade it. There might be a change of, a cost from time to time, but we'll have a relationship with you that means that you can enjoy the music and the
Mm.
film that you love enjoying for the rest of your life, and maybe even for your kids' lives and stuff like that. So it's the way of thinking that I think is really important, and circularity can help to drive that through some of the things we've talked about: deposits, right to repair, understanding value. But ultimately, it's going to be a piece that a company designs in not just a better product, but other things that go with it. For example, servitization.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that I sort of feel I'd be curious to get your thoughts on is essentially how you think this might influence different business models. And I guess maybe just to sort of throw a few things into the pot, if you think about the pre-electric vehicle days, if you buy a car, one of the anecdotal statistics I was told from a friend in automotive is they said about 50% of the revenue generated from a car comes from parts and accessories. So the business model of the company selling you a car, they are anticipating to make money back on the fact you need a new exhaust or you need a new carburetor and tires and all that sort of stuff. And I think, I've been thinking about also things like printers and ink, and the fact that, the printer isn't really the hustle, it's the ink that's the hustle. Even little products like Yoto players and Tonys and things like this, the product that plays the music is one thing, but actually it's the little cheap cards that are actually quite a good markup. I wonder whether you think we will see a different type of product design, a different type of business interaction. I think you alluded to sort of product as a service a little bit there, but I wonder if you could just double down and expand on that a little bit. How do you think that'll change?
Yeah, well, partly, and again, the phone is a good example. It's where you design more function in, or you design longevity in. You've actually got to have a relationship with that customer, with that consumer, because it's going to outlive certain other things. Like whether battery is a good example, really good example, the battery. So battery technology is going to improve, speed of processing might improve. I mean, actually, the Fairphone, I haven't had the best experience with them. I mentioned to you, but it is a good example because you can upgrade. I mean, the shell is what it is, but you can upgrade the components. So if, as for example, you get, you're slightly more wealthy, or you value a camera more than you did before, you can upgrade that component. And I think that's a good example of servitizing, more like aligned with the car example. Again, you could upgrade your vehicle, and there probably will be more of that over the air, like the Tesla is. It's you
Yeah.
rock up and your Tesla goes quicker. Like, what happened? Well, I connected overnight and I did it for you, sir. You know, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I don't want to go faster, but thank you very much. And Sonos is a good example of that as well. I mean, Sonos is a thing that sits in the corner and is either dumb or smart. I think it was dumb for quite a while. It's becoming smarter. They missed a trick on that one, but it's sat in the corner. It's relatively benign, but you have a bunch of services around it, so they enable services. And in fact, for them, I think, you know, some of the things they struggled with were the services around an amazing product, really amazing product, very high quality, very long lasting, as long as the software's there to support it, which is another issue. So I think those are the adaptations. But as you load more value into a product, you go down a service route because people end up renting things rather than buying them. And again, there's plenty of examples of that from history. You know, we always used to rent televisions and washing machines, and then they became relatively cheaper, and we all bought one or two or God knows how many you need. Anyway, but actually, those sorts of items do lend themselves to service, because one, you want them to last a while. Two, there are upgrades that can make them better. You know, and three, if they become too expensive, you know, it's a way of affording them. So those for me are the key challenges, I think.
And I guess if it's not going off on too much of a tangent, one of the things that we sort of loosely discussed was essentially how old school batteries essentially had a standardization model. You could buy a device, say a remote control car, as a kid, and you fast learned that actually I need rechargeable. But the good news was that you had this option of buying alkali, shredding through them at a ridiculous rate, or realizing you could buy a AA battery which had basically the same characteristics and you can recharge it at home. I don't know whether I'm being naive here, but for the sake of discussion, do you think we will revert back to some of these models? Do you think Duracell is hypothetically on the cusp of releasing lithium polymer technology that not just designers can use, but consumers can then safely and reliably reincorporate into products to extend their life?
You'd hope. I mean, here's another example, right? So here's a Panasonic camera. If you can see that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Removable battery. You can recharge it in situ, but you also get a charger that is unique to this battery, that's unique to this camera, that plugs into the wall like any other charger. And there's 3 levels of ridiculous in that, you know, but at least it's removable, so it's safer when I chuck it in the bin, which I won't because it's brilliant. But you know what I mean? Like, that standardization is a really, really important, really good example, a really important point, and one that would you know, solve some of these challenges, because you probably end up with removable, replaceable. So I think it relates to the right to repair and deposits on batteries, because they're all kind of linked together, and there will be companies then offering standardization, whether that's adaptation or, you know, service or whatever. I mean, how long has it taken to deal with this lightning connection thing? Like, you know, a billion years in tech time, like 10 years or whatever, you know, and we kind of got there, I guess. You know, no involvement in it at all, other than having a lot of lightning cables. But, you know, I think that's a really good example of, you know, it's a little bit silly, and not really serving much purpose other than selling a lot of lightning cables, which are probably a bit more expensive than they need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing, is whether essentially, I appreciate some designers might be saying you're stifling innovation, in which case I think the answer would be, if you need an exotic version of a battery because, let's call it out, you're Apple and you think you're better than that, then it's fine. You pay a 10% levy on that, which is taxed. But actually, if you're a designer and you're a little startup and you go, well, you know what? I don't need to have that 2mm perfect fit. I can just have it a bit bigger and make the product 2mm wider. Then you just go, okay, great. I don't have to pay that, you know, hefty tax levy on top of the battery. In which case, I think that's the nudge in the right behavior, which I hope, you know, again, it's splitting the difference in that you can have radical innovation that needs, probably medical devices desperately need a really picky, specific battery, in which case we all know medical devices cost a ton of money. So adding another 10 pence on the bill of materials is not a headache for a medical company. But if you're making a cheap Christmas toy, you absolutely should be trying to extend it and not just, as you said, have it chuck in landfill and think, oh, well, that's the end of it. We can just buy the next one next year. Without ranting too much about them going on the same points, I just wondered to close, is there any other predictions, or it's very hard to predict, would you say, anticipations of what you hope is the fruits of your labor with all this work? What are you hoping will be the end result, the impact?
Well, I'm hoping that above everything else, that more people understand that when you chuck something in the bin with a battery in it, it could cause a fire and it could kill somebody. And when you leave something plugged in at home, it could cause a problem. And we all do it. I do it every night, put my phone in overnight. But it could cause a problem. So I hope awareness is raised. I hope there are less issues immediately than there have been, because it's just getting ridiculous. And I do hope that decision makers, politicians and others, manufacturers, get a hold of this and say, okay, that is important, let's deal with it. And it's also, we didn't talk about this, but it's also an opportunity, because this stuff's quite, reverse engineer it, right? There's some people digging some stuff out the ground and sending it here free of charge, relatively speaking. And the least we could do is make sure that we don't throw it away or burn it too soon, that we keep hold of those rare earth materials that don't really exist here in any great quantity, but we're going to need, so that there's an opportunity that we're staring in the face as well. And it's starting to be sort of grabbed hold of now. But I do wonder if there's a sort of charismatic megafauna equivalent of, we're worrying about, car batteries, EVs, which aren't really a massive problem yet, but will be really, really big. And we're sort of overlooking the beetles and the insects, which are the small lithium-ion batteries that exist already, that are doing a lot of work, damage, in equal measure. And we need to get hold and deal with that problem. We can't really wait for the charismatic megafauna to have their day. We do actually need a bit of time spent on the small ones as well.
No, and so I really appreciate the attitude that, every contribution that a designer can make, and as I said, I don't think it has to be absolutely colossal business model overhauls. I think sometimes it can be as simple as starting out with a notion of just stop gluing in the battery. It's not helping anyone, And so I think
window of opportunity.
I'm basically compiling a list which starts at, for the love, pity's sake, will you not do this, all the way through to the very aspirational, hardcore, this will cost you millions, but you might be one of these mega brands that can afford it. So I think all designers can probably contribute at some level without breaking their backs or the bank balance of a project. So
agree entirely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, John, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I'll look forward to that report. It's probably live by the time someone's watching this, so we'll put links below. So can't wait for that.
Fingers crossed. Cheers, Jude.
Thanks a lot.